Hello, my name is Richard Pepe. Thank you for stopping by. If you would click the like button, I'd appreciate it. This is the second video I've had on the situation in South Africa, and I plan to have more because this is going to become a very, very, very important economic and humanitarian problem. Let me begin by showing you a graph. I'm not sure how well you can see it, but the source of this is United Nations as of July 2013. And it is an attempt to demonstrate the relative change in populations by areas of the world. We have a curve for Africa, a line for Asia, a line for Europe, a line for South America, and a line for North America. As you see on the bottom here, that basically population growth has leveled off, and the United Nations think that it's going to stay that way for the next 100 years. That they're projecting that the lower lines here, which are represented by North America, South America, and Europe, will stay low in terms of the development of increased populations. This is 1 billion, this is 2 billion, this is 3 billion, this is 4 billion, this is 5 billion. Asia, as we know, the two most populous countries on the planet are both Asian countries, India and China. They project them to stay around 4 billion. Basically, all of the growth in the population between now and the end of the century is going to come from Africa, if this projection is correct. This line represents Africa. As you can see, it goes up to almost reaching the Asian total of about 4 billion people. Right now it's about 1 billion. Now, Africa is a very large continent. It's mind-boggling how big it is. We forget how big it is, and it has a lot of resources. But this is a tremendous increase in population that's going to have to be fed. And this is why I find this situation in South Africa so interesting. Because we have a number of racial components to the problem that's developing in South Africa. The Boers are seen by many blacks as basically interlopers and exploiters. But if you look at the food projections that are going to be needed, the Boers are going to be required to do what they've been doing, which is supply Southern Africa with a lot of food. Because the requirements of Africans generally for food is going to increase dramatically. As I said, it's going to go from roughly a little over 1 billion or a little under 1 billion in 2010 to 4 billion by the end of the century. Now, people that are old like me will remember this book. I don't think you can read it, but it's called The Limits to Growth, and it came out in the early 1970s, and it was based on a series of studies that were done in the late 60s, so it's 50 years. And I'm going to read to you the back blurb of the book, which basically was the horror show that we were supposed to see within the next 50 years, where we are now. A team of MIT scientists, with the aid of a giant computer, has completed a study of the future of present growth continues. Their inescapable conclusions are beyond anyone's grimmest fears. Possibly when as little as 70 years, our social and economic systems will collapse unless drastic changes are made very soon. Now, if you read the book, one of the projections they make concerns food production. No one could have seen the tremendous advances that were made in food production in the last 50 years ago, unless they had a magic crystal ball that would allow them to see what's happened with engineering. and scientific advances in seed, fertilizer, this kind of thing. Brazil was a negligible food producer 50 years ago. Today, Brazil is one of the great success stories in the production of food. In Brazil, most farms, commercial farms of any size, are started and owned by corporations, because it takes a certain amount of money in Brazil to utilize the land properly and to properly treat it. But once it's done, Brazil's land is good land for food production. Now in South Africa, the Boer population is doing a tremendous thing for the black population. It's giving them access to food at a reasonable price. If the worst fears are realized, and the blacks, in fact, take the Boer land without compensation, I don't know if the Boers are going to react with violence or not. I don't know if there's going to be a civil war there or not. But certainly the lesson of Zimbabwe is a sobering lesson for everyone, including the blacks. Now, there's a certain amount of dislike between blacks and whites, and we ought to put that on the table to begin with. I saw on TV a black woman on, I don't know if it was MTV or one of these channels devoted to young people and such, say to the audience, white people, admit it, you hate black people. Well, there's something to that. Years ago, I read a report, a sociological study about how people in Canada feel about different ethnic groups. And they did a survey of people in Toronto, which of course is a British Protestant demographic, and then did a survey in Montreal, which is a Catholic demographic, French Catholic demographic. But it's interesting how similar the populations felt about black people. That this is, I'm not doing it, I don't have the study at hand and I can't link to it, but I can tell you roughly what it said, and it's of no mystery to any of us, I think. That in Toronto, if you ask the average Torontonian, who of course is a northwestern European Protestant, how close he felt to different ethnic groups, you could predict what in fact the study showed. They felt closer to Scandinavians, English, Germans, and other northern European Protestant populations. And then then there's another column, and there's Irish Catholics, who of course look more like British than the Eastern and European peoples in the next column. Then there's a little more distance between them and the so-called new immigrants, Slavs, Poles, Jews, Italians, Greeks, Portuguese. Then there's another space. They felt less close to Mexicans, Central Americans, South Americans, maybe Indians. And then there's a space, again, further, they felt less close to Asians, Koreans, Chinese, Japanese. And they felt least close to the blacks. And the same pattern showed up in Montreal, although in Montreal, the major population, which was French and Catholic, excuse me, felt closer to Catholic groups than they did in Montreal. But on the black question, blacks were by far the furthest away in terms of how the host population felt about different ethnic groups. Now, black people pick that up. Black people are as aware of this as anybody else. Black people know that they are not liked, as a whole, by white people. And it's understandable that there's some resentment, particularly in South Africa, where you have black people resent the way they are regarded as less valuable than white people by whites. And of course, you have the history of apartheid and that kind of exclusion. Nevertheless, we've got a problem here. We've got this problem. We've got to develop an economic situation that is going to account for food for a population that's going to expand to 4 billion by the end of the century. Now, I don't know whether or not white South Africans feel the same way towards development and towards blacks based on whether they are English or Boers. My understanding is there has been maybe a competition, maybe a friendly competition, maybe an unfriendly competition between people that are English, would consider themselves of English derivation, and people that would consider themselves Dutch or Boer derivation. But from what I see on the internet and YouTube and TV and so forth, it seems like the Boers are basically of Dutch extraction, have their own religious and language traditions, and want to keep them, and want a certain amount of separation between themselves and the black population. I don't know if the English feel the same way or how they feel about each other. But I want to look at my notes because I have come across 3, and I think they are all representing Boer populations, 3 different positions on the relationship between whites and blacks in South Africa. And one position I'm going to represent as the most antagonistic to the black population would be represented by Jan Lamprecht. I'm not sure how to pronounce that. He is on, let's say, the far right. He has a channel called the History Review channel. He's an interesting guy, but there's no question he has a lot of antagonism toward blacks and Jews. The middle column I'm going to call Simon Roche and the Soutlander column. It looks like Simon Roche, I don't think is a Boer, but the Soutlanders, or Soutlanders, I guess is the way they pronounce it, is basically planning, if you will, for a civil war where they are going to be attacked by the blacks. They're not antagonistic to the blacks in the sense that they're trying to develop military capabilities to attack the blacks. They think the blacks are going to attack them. And the most agreeable to having trying to work something out with the blacks would be the column Ernest Roots and an organization called Afri Forum. Now, all of these groups would oppose land expropriation without compensation. And I believe they're all right to do that. I don't know if the expropriation process goes forward, there's going to be violence or not. But black people have to understand that they're taking a chance if they're successful, that South Africa is going to be turned into Zimbabwe too, but with much more serious consequences, because Rhodesia was a relatively small producer compared to South Africa. South Africa has 25 to 35,000 commercial farms. How are you going to replace that amount of food? Now, Ernst Roots, who is, as I say, the most accepting of a racially fair and accepting of the black-white community working together, has stressed the fact that if you do away with property rights. You do away with incentives. If you do away with incentives, you do away with the ability to invest and work. Zimbabwe has been a disaster, more probably for the blacks than the whites, because whites lost property, but whites have places to go, and one of the places white Rhodesians went to South Africa. Zimbabweans who were black and poor all of a sudden had a struggle making their daily calorie count. If you explode this across the continent of Southern Africa, you've got a serious problem for demographics across Africa. Now, black people have an unrealistic approach to why they are poor. There are two black YouTube figures, three black YouTube figures, two or three, that I watch because they're interesting, but to me they miss the point. One is a woman called Sensei Aishitemasu. I think I'm pronouncing that right. She's a young woman. She deals with film reviews and cultural problems, this kind of thing, through a black perspective. And she has said on her channel, we do not center white people on this channel, which is understandable. There are 40 million blacks here. There should be a channel for black reviews, black perspective on culture, movies, that kind of thing. But she's also said that she hates capitalism. It's one thing to say it. It's another thing to understand what capitalism and the private market has given to black people. Not just white people, but black people have a manifestly higher standard of living in the United States than they do in Africa. And that's because of what white people have done. That's what white people in the free market have brought to blacks. I've dealt with that in my first video on the South African Civil War probability. Tariq Nasheed is another black YouTuber who I find interesting, and again, he focuses on one aspect, which is white supremacy. He doesn't see, and there's no discussion of what kind of economy he would replace capitalism with, the free market with. Another black woman is Yvette Carnell. She has a channel, and she also has this guy named Tone Talks. I don't know his name, but they talk a lot about reparations. White people are rich because they have exploited black labor. Well, if you transfer this kind of thinking to Africa, and Africans agree with this kind of thinking, I don't see how this problem of the 4 billion more Africans are going to get fed. I would like to, end on a cheerier note, but I'm not sure that there is a cheerier note here. If this thing erupts in violence, or there's exploitation of the whites, or appropriation of their land, or the violence against the farmers get worse, or the situation in Zimbabwe gets worse, I guess I'd like to know from South Africans, would the white Boers and the white English respond the same way? I don't know the makeup of Simon Roche's Suitlanders organization, but if there is an actual violence, would the English join with the Suitlanders, which I gather is a Boer organization, or would they turn away from that? I don't think Simon Roche himself is a Boer. I think he said in one of his videos that he's Irish and originally Catholic. I don't think he's Catholic now, but I get the impression that the organization itself is made up of Boers. Do Boers and English see this possibility for violence the same way? Do they see the possibility of working something out with the blacks, and the blacks accept this reality that they're going to need white help to navigate this population explosion that's supposedly going to happen over the next 80 years or so? Thank you for watching. I appreciate it.